yo, does it seem like the women's rugby is outpacing the men's? For me, I think there is a clear argument that in the place where women's rugby is right now, is it will far surpass what the men's have been able to do at this point. Now, mind you, I don't think it'll be necessarily get to the level where the men's is in terms of its total numbers, just because of time. But in terms of what the growth process will be from where it is now to where it will be in 10 years, which is about the amount of time that you use to be able to measure a sport, I think it will outpace what the men are doing. Now, you ask, why is it doing that? All right. Because there's been so much stigma on what women's rugby is capable of, how people feel about it. Well, I mean, look, let's kind of look at the evidence that's been presented around it with us. Number one, women's rugby has now put in leadership. The World Rugby Council is now far more packed full of women than it ever has been before, which made a huge impact for the game. But more importantly, it's younger women. All right, we're talking about leaders. One of the people that we have, Ada Milby, who's been on the show. She was the first woman to be on the Rugby Women's Count on the World Rugby Council. You're talking about a person in their late 30s, early 40s at best, really mid to late 30s. This is a younger mindset. They've been closer to the game, but has experience. And you have a slew of women, Kesha, Kesha Downs, and people like that who have been able to make an impact on the game and been able to do things that are current to the time. So it's impacted the way that the women's. Once again, we talk about things like the TikTok sponsorship. I know World Rugby doesn't necessarily directly have control on women's Six Nations, but they are a heavy influence on that. And TikTok being a part of that was a heavy influence. That's part of the reason why Ileana Mar got a huge push on social media way back in 2021 after her initial rise of popularity during the 2021 Olympics, 2020 Olympics, 2021 Olympics itself. Of course, then you start to see even the formats of games that are being now recreated, like the WXV tournament, which I think has actually been phenomenal success for what it's worth, for exactly what it's supposed to be, which is ironic because we're also against it for the men's, and it's good reason it's against it for the men's, but for the women's, it made perfect sense. So now you have regular games that people are able to see. You have an understood schedule on a centralized location that is able to build out from there. And then lastly, the decisions that are made across the individual unions that start from the World Rugby Council. You've seen far more women being empowered by basically girl rugby growth programs. We talk about them in tier 2 countries like in Africa. We've talked about it in the United States itself, Africa being like Zimbabwe, Uganda. You've seen the growth of it in South Africa. Like they are starting to pace out the women and actually bring them up into the coal. And that goes with good, young, and current leadership that understands the programs. Number two, I don't think the women are kind of at the behest of tradition. Most of the women's programs really didn't start kicking off until somewhere around the mid 80s, late 80s. I'm not saying they didn't exist. I'm saying they didn't really start kicking off. And obviously 1991 Rugby World Cup women's was the first major showcase, and that didn't even get filmed, but I think it provided the initial seeds. And since then, that's whenever your traditions start. So the women aren't at the chokehold of having to be traditionalists. They don't have a purism. They don't have a rugby way. They get to actually create and formulate their own traditions that are new and that are appealed. And to some extent, being so heavily doubted in the past has now helped them be able to be stronger and learn how to be able to maneuver through the audience to be able to have a greater impact on those future generations of women that are coming through. So you get to be able to make your own rules and not be stuck to this, archaic mindset that outside of the old leadership of the men being a aggravating force. Number three, professionalism. I look, for whatever it's worth, man, professionalism is working for the European rugby. And the Premiership rugby absolutely is doing its damage. Clearly, the WXV tournament, all three winners were all from Europe, Ireland, Scotland, and England. That is major. That means more rugby solely done, even if not all the women are getting paid, but they get to do it do better day-to-days, which means they get better time to increase their skill, which gives them better chance of being able to showcase the best version of rugby. And England is definitely one of the biggest benefactors. New Zealand has a partial pro system. Australia has a pro system. So it's like, well, at least from the international, they're professionals internationally, but they have a professional setup in some way, shape, or form where players can concentrate primarily on this craft. And I think that also starts to impact what you do for the girls that are coming up in the next generation. Because I'm not a big believer that you have to be in a rugby culture to be able to be good at rugby. I think you need to be able to be in a situation where people will teach you rugby in the best way that fits to your culture, which I think is lost within the men's side because everybody is looking for the New Zealand replicant, the South African replicant, and from time to time, the English replicant. Not really much else from anybody else. Zimbabwe as well, but Zimbabwe is connected often to South Africa, so it gets that connection. If your coaches aren't from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, or to some extent England, and or the UK, let's call it what it is, the UK, then you're underestimated. But those cultures don't necessarily fit to the culture that you're in. So the women aren't getting held to that, and I think you're seeing much more customization, which means the girls that are coming up get to be themselves and be able to play in a style that is formidable for them, which leads to a more entertaining style of rugby that goes along with it. And number five, I think I'm on number five. Number five, I think ultimately there's just a growth of women's sports that is starting to gain attention. We see it a lot in the US, and there's a strong development and promotion for women's sports. I think financially it obviously makes sense simply because of the fact that, hey, women spend money on a greater variety of things statistically than the men's side. And of course, if you add women into your sports, you also get to increase more of the population that's included in your revenue books. But aside from that, the amount of promotion that goes into it, the amount of attention that's going into that is now putting more girls in a position that they don't have to be stigmatized as heavy on playing contact sports at that, let alone any other sports outside of what people would primarily reduce them into doing. So being able to step outside the range, being able to have people that are presented as representations, positive representations of those opportunities that they're able to access is setting it up. And I think the women's rugby game is going to outpace the men's simply because the men's side is restricted. It's absolutely restricted. It's restricted and also, ironically, also saturated to some extent. And if you are not able to add more growth or more population into it, that saturation is just going to reach levels that people aren't even going to watch the games because they're like, either I could have played, or I got tired of playing, or I felt politically like the game was going to hold me back. And so I just don't care anymore. And so they stop watching. They don't let the next generation watch because they don't have any consistency to it. And hence you watch development and reach and financial impetus just drop significantly over and over. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are on this. And I do want to know that, what do you figure? Do you think I'm out of my space, or do you think that there's actually something to it? Or maybe there's not, and maybe it's just like everybody's kind of screwed or winning in the same way. They just have to keep it all together in some way, shape, or form. Just my thoughts here. I just like to BS a little bit.